the 12th Annual Tax Indaba is currently underway in Boksburg. Speaking now is Deputy SARS Commissioner Johnstone Makhubu, who's delivering the keynote address virtually. Let's listen in.
We can create a comprehensive view of the taxpayer. We still work in an environment that is fragmented. We want, if I use loosely a word, that when you get into your account, you should be able to see everything about your account, including what disputes you have with us, what amounts outstanding, what amounts are due to you from a credit point of view. We want to ensure that that bank type transaction environment platform is made available so that you can be able to interact with us. And ultimately, we want to pass the ability to maintain the account to the taxpayer so that, again, we disintermediate the need to be able to do some of these bank verification and reconciliation work that we do on the back end within SARS. That allows us to push some of the resources into much more meaningful work as we move forward. Again, our case management system, those of you that have worked at SARS and are within SARS will know for a long time we've been working on Service Manager as our case management platform. We believe that it is time now to make that case management system more intelligent, and we are working hard to ensure that we move in that regard. So when you hear that there is about 500 million rands that has been given to SARS to modernize its platforms, part of this money is going towards these programs. Number 5, I think if you look at an entity-based compliance model, it's important for us that we move away from looking at entities from a silo point of view, that we are able to look at you as an entity to be able to derive our perceptions of you from a compliance point of view. So it's going to increasingly going forward not be about your VAT compliance or your pay-as-you-earn compliance. It's going to be about how you comply as an entity. And this is very important because sometimes we are able to frustrate the experience simply because we look at an entity from a product point of view. And it's important that we integrate across. The building of an instant payment system in partnership with SAB, why is this important? It's because number 7 talks about VAT modernization. And we issued a paper a couple of years ago, and we are refreshing that paper because we believe that the payment system and modernization of VAT are interlinked. So we are looking at e-reporting amongst other things, and we've looked at other geographies and jurisdictions to see whether e-reporting or e-invoicing, what of these would suit our environment. But we are convinced that if we look at the tax gap, we've just finished a study with the IMF that tells us that there's significant work we need to do around the VAT tax gap. And this will come handy when we start to modernize our systems. Ideally, you want to make sure that where possible, as entities transact in points of sales, we are able to get that information shared with the tax administration. Ideally, if we take away issues of apportionment and such complications in treatment of transactions, and you look at just straightforward transactions, you start to believe that it's possible that you can do some pre-population of your VAT 201s to an extent. And again, it's a journey. We don't think it's something you can do over three years. We think it's probably a 10-year journey. Legislative amendments are necessary. And we are keen to take this journey because we think it takes us to the right platform. Now, if you look at customs and excise in our environment, you'll hear us talking about our constant worry about illicit trade. Illicit trade is important. It's important from curbing it perspective, in our view, to try and also make sure that the tax gap we are experiencing, many studies have been done around illicit accessible product trade. And we think that it's important that we start to look at how we modernize both the customs side of our business as well as our excise part of the business. I'm glad that for the first time, the conversations today will not only focus on tax, but will create a balance so that we can also talk about things like customs valuations and how those affect transfer pricing, for instance. These are important topics to be able to get into. In all of this, the whole of government approach is very important. SARS on its own cannot be able to change the dial and shift the dial. It's going to be very important that we are able to work together in the government environment to shift the dial. Of course, we also want to talk about what has happened to to debt in the country. Of course, I'm much more interested not in a historic context, but maybe let's touch on it. I would like to talk more about what we as SARS are doing in the context. And I'll leave the rest for Chris to talk to. Now, we know how our debt to GDP trajectory has looked over the last while. And there's a number of things, and I think sometimes we are quick to forget that we come from the days of reconstruction and development program. And we needed to be able, the state needed to be able to expand service coverage to a number of unserviced areas of our economy. And it became important in doing that to an extent to ensure that there is some debt that is taken on. We also know that we had global financial crisis that came about that required government to act in terms of trying to insulate the fiscal environment. Fast forward, we also know we had to deal with the Swan event in COVID-19, and all these events have meant that the government has to be able to act in trying to protect the environment to an extent, using reserves, to an extent, going to the borrowings markets, and that has driven, to an extent, the debt that we have seen. But of course, there are other arguments that can be put forward around how we have managed our expenditure side of our fiscal framework, and we can talk about that time granted. But again, if you then look at the extraction rates in terms of tax to GDP, you have seen that we have constantly seen a range between 23 to 25% in terms of tax GDP over the periods. And again, Treasury has given some projections in terms of what is expected going forward. And again, this for us is important because it tells us whether we are able to extract the taxes that we need to be able to extract without sometimes necessarily relying on policy measures. And from a tax administration point of view, we are keen to say, how do we affect that number by extracting more efficiencies from a tax administration? The challenges we continue to face are these, colleagues, and they are not disappearing. And it's important, I think, when we contextualize our conversations throughout this conference, that we remember that the country key challenges continue to stubbornly persist. Unemployment, inequality, and poverty is ultimately what we need to balance as we deal with the questions of debt, questions of raising revenue, whether through administration efficiencies or through policy measures. We are trying to respond to a situation. You will notice that in excess of 60% of the budget is positioned towards the social wage. Because again, you're trying to balance what we are facing in the environment. Now, this balance between expenditure demands and how you respond in terms of revenue and tax policy has been persisting, and the fiscal framework has tried to balance this, and it's an intricate process. I've said with our colleagues at Treasury, and Keith, you would know, it's not an easy process. So it's a difficult process. Amongst others, fiscal consolidation has been an approach that National Treasury has taken, but fundamental there is to ensure that revenue mobilization is also increased. And as a tax administration, we believe that revenue mobilization through a compliance program that is sound becomes very important going forward. Now, what are we doing from a tax administration point of view? We believe, as we have said at the G20 Ministers of Finance dialogue that happened earlier this year and sometime a couple of weeks ago, I think domestic resource mobilization as an approach is not going to go away, and it's important for us to intensify it. In answering the question, can SARS meet the seemingly ever-growing demand on revenue, we believe that if we attune our minds and resource ourselves and leverage all those that are in the ecosystem, we believe we actually can. We think we can. The challenges that we'll continue to face that are important for us to note in as far as tax administrations globally. When we speak to our colleagues all over the world, you get a sense that the problems that we are facing in the South African context are not only unique to South Africa. They are telling us that digitalization as well as artificial intelligence cannot be ignored any longer. It's going to be very important that we deal with this. We have an aging workforce in most tax administrations. If you look at the SARS case, we've got on average around 47, 48 years, but coupled with that is an experience of around 18 years, tenure, which suggests that you are dealing, yes, with an aging workforce, and you need to start to introduce a new DNA into the system. Young people need to come in, but that also suggests that you are carrying costs double in your tax administration because you are injecting new talent, which costs you, but also you need to retain the experience. I've worked in the energy sector and I know firsthand experience the dangers of not managing your brain trust in an organization very well. I will not mention names. I think the growing tax debt, we are sitting with around, as at the end of the financial year last year, we're sitting at around 513 billion rands of monies that are owed to the fiscus by taxpayers. And again, if you are sitting with a balance sheet like that, any shareholder will ask you, what are you doing to leverage that balance sheet? And how much of that balance sheet should you be writing off? And SARS has over the years not had substantial write-offs of its debt book. However, I think even if we allowed for some substantial write-offs of the debt book, we are of the view that there is still an opportunity in there, like our colleagues are telling us globally, that we can be able to leverage that. There is an issue around acceleration of e-commerce. You would have seen us last year starting to charge VAT on low-value goods coming through e-commerce, and we have done away with the flat rate of 20% on goods that are coming in. Again, this is pointing towards us trying to say, how do we follow what our colleagues are doing globally? The proliferation of cross-border tax and financial crime is a global challenge, and we think we are not unique in South Africa. We've been public around cases that we have confronted in the tobacco industry, enabled by some players in the financial services sector, and we think that that is a tip of an iceberg, and we believe that we need to entrench ourselves in as far as that work is concerned. Underfunding and investment into administration capacity, we think to an extent we have turned the corner, and thank to the Minister for some additional 7.5 billion that was given, and we believe that we would be able to leverage that going forward to an extent to assist in ensuring that we drive our interventions going forward. I think the issue of an untapped tax gap, our colleagues globally tell us that there is a constant tax gap that we need to be on top of, equally across various jurisdictions. Now, if you look at domestic resource mobilization, and I will not spend much time here, but I think I want us to leave with an understanding that it is an instrument that we are trying to utilize to move us forward in terms of dealing with issues that relate to raising additional revenues. So, excuse me. We want to utilize DRM to achieve fiscal integrity domestically. And how are we going to do this? We believe that it can be done by making sure that taxes and duties are responsive, that even non-tax sources like royalties and fees are also leveraged to be able to drive.
All right, it's just coming for about 8 minutes towards 10 o'clock, and we've been listening to SARS Deputy Commissioner Johnstone Makhubu speaking at the 12th Annual Tax Indaba currently taking place in Boksburg. Fascinating insights about the work that SARS is doing. This is a 3-day gathering, and of course it's expected to touch on a number of issues, including the latest trends in taxation and ways in which SARS can tackle some of South Africa's key socio-economic issues, at least play their part.